Has a single, almost imperceptible clue ever completely changed the course of an investigation? Today, I will tell you how a tiny detail completely transformed the most challenging case I faced as a forensic doctor. It all started one ordinary morning in Montevideo. An elderly man was found in his home, apparently without injuries or signs of violence. At first glance, it seemed like a simple case, natural death. But sometimes, death is not what it seems. Before we begin, let me know in the comments where you're watching this video from, so I can see how far it has reached. My name is Luis Padron. I am 40 years old, and I have spent more than 15 years dedicated to forensic medicine here in Uruguay. In this story, you will learn how meticulous observation and patience to find those invisible details allowed me to uncover a truth no one expected. When I arrived at the house, the place was calm. The scene showed no signs of struggle or disorder. Mr. Gomez's body, a 78-year-old man, lay peacefully in his favorite armchair, as if he had simply fallen asleep. There was nothing indicating a domestic accident or violence. At first, this made me think his death was natural or due to some pre-existing condition. But in this job, not everything is what it seems, and every piece of evidence, no matter how small, tells a story. During the initial examination, I discovered something that immediately caught my attention. A small stain on the edge of a nearby table, barely noticeable but different from the usual dirt. It was a substance that, at first sight, could go unnoticed, but in my experience, details cannot be ignored. What seemed like a closed case began to open up in my mind. That stain, that insignificant detail, was a starting point for an investigation that would forever change the interpretation of that death and taught me the importance of never underestimating small pieces of evidence. But I will tell you all about that in detail in this video. Do you want to know how that tiny piece of evidence turned everything we thought we knew upside down? Stay with me and don't miss this story, which revealed not only an unexpected truth, but also an invaluable lesson for any investigator or curious mind interested in forensic science that I remember that day with almost vivid clarity. Sometimes I think about all the cases I have seen and how each one leaves a mark on a different part of my career. But this one was different. Upon entering the house, the first thing you notice is the tranquility of the place, the silence barely interrupted by the faint echo of my footsteps on the wooden floor. The gentleman's body was lying in the living room, positioned in a way that suggested he had simply sat down to rest and never got up again. There were no visible signs of violence, nothing indicating a violent fall or confrontation. As a forensic specialist, that initially tend to work somewhat against the theory of crime or serious accident. However, the silence and apparent calm at the scene are often just a superficial layer over a much more complicated story. While checking the surroundings, my eyes stopped at details that I suppose anyone might have overlooked. A glass of water with a slight stain, barely noticeable, a side table with some pills arranged a bit disorderly, but nothing that screamed alert. However, what caught my attention the most was that faint aroma, something subtle, almost imperceptible, floating in the air, something metallic and sweet, a smell not usually present in an ordinary home. It was then that I decided to investigate beyond the body and the obvious scene. Forensic medicine often teaches you that the key lies in the minimal elements, those small clues that seem irrelevant but have the power to reshape the entire story. I began to examine the body more carefully. There were no obvious external signs of trauma, but that did not rule out an internal cause or perhaps something related to poisoning. During the autopsy, I noticed that the liver looked slightly different from usual, a sign of possible prolonged intoxication or exposure to a chemical agent. But what really caught my attention was a sample taken from the stomach, which finally revealed a substance that should not have been there. It was not something anyone would expect to find in a typical natural death case. That substance, although in minute amounts, completely altered the course of the investigation. While awaiting the laboratory results, I had to hold back the unease that was beginning to form inside me. At that moment, the questions multiplied. How did that substance enter his body? Was it accidental, or was someone else involved? That question constantly ran through my mind. I returned to the house to look for more clues, to try to understand the context, and that is when the twist in the story began to take shape. I found a detail so small almost imperceptible to the untrained eye, a barely visible stain on the lower edge of a door frame. It looked like dust residue or some type of dried liquid. But when I collected for analysis, I discovered it was a rare chemical compound used in certain uncommon poisons. The more I delved into the case, the more the idea of a natural death blurred, and the possibility of something hidden grew. Interviews with neighbors and relatives also shed little light. Everyone described the gentleman as a calm person, without apparent enemies and in good health until recently. However, one neighbor mentioned having seen unusual movements in the house at strange hours, something that seemed insignificant at first, but now took on new dimension. The presence of that substance in minimal amounts made me think of an unintentional spill, but combined with the clean and orderly scene, it indicated someone had been extremely careful. Back in the laboratory, the confirmation came with a mix of surprise and caution. The substance was a rarely used poison, undetectable in conventional tests and causing a slow organic failure, almost imperceptible in an initial medical inspection. It was the first time I had seen something like this in my career, and precisely in a case that at first glance seemed so simple. That revelation made me realize the murderer had not wanted to leave obvious traces, trusting that the natural cause would be accepted without much question. But the forensic part of me could not accept that, because the truth always finds a crack to peek through, no matter how small. I then decided to review the victim's life again, looking for any kind of connection or motive that could justify such a meticulous act. He was not a public figure nor someone with known enemies, but sometimes the reasons lie in the smallest details. An inheritance, a veiled enmity, or a secret kept carefully. The investigation led me to talk with people who seemed to have nothing to do with it, but little by little, through scattered fragments, they began to form a disturbing puzzle. A distant nephew, a former partner with dubious intentions, and a hidden story that no one wanted to bring to light. Every step I took seemed to increase the tension, as if every discovery pulled a thread that could unleash the truth long kept hidden. And in that path, I realized something fundamental. In forensic medicine, you don't just examine bodies. You decipher stories, read silences, and interpret evasions. The key was to make sure nothing went unnoticed, to look with the patience of someone who knows that the truth does not always come easily, that it demands time, an honest gaze, and above all, a mind willing not to settle. That is how that small detail, the minimal presence of an almost invisible substance, changed not only the perspective of the case, but also my way of understanding the fragility of truth. I learned that the tiniest piece of evidence can contain the most heartbreaking testimony, that in meticulous attention lies the power to transform a simple death into a story demanding justice. Even today, when I recount this case, I feel a mixture of satisfaction and respect for the complexity of life and death, for the need to always be careful with appearances and to listen to what is not said, to seek, with patience and dedication, what the body and surroundings can reveal when someone is willing to observe carefully. What began as a simple examination turned into a profound journey to understand the story behind that death, a constant reminder to me, as a forensic specialist, that I must never abandon curiosity, because sometimes a tiny, almost invisible piece of evidence can be the key that opens the door to the truth hidden beneath the surface. That experience marked the before and after my career. It taught me that in our work, every second, every gesture, and every seemingly insignificant detail can be the thread that brings to light what death tries to silence. And that lesson I carry with me in every case since then, with the certainty that in the forensic world, patience and meticulousness are not only tools, but the path to finding justice amidst silence. The silence that filled the house seemed to have thickened, filling the air with an almost palpable density. Each time I mentally reviewed what had happened, I felt how the case transformed into a web of details that, although fragile, resisted any attempt to dismiss them. I returned to the scene again and again, repeating those small journeys I had already taken, but with a sharper gaze, as if something was waiting for me patiently, hidden in plain sight, waiting to be discovered. Time seemed to stretch in each moment, as if the house itself conspired to keep me from leaving before accepting the secrets it held. Examining the glass on the table, I noticed a slight stain, almost imperceptible, like a mark left by an evaporated liquid that did not match what one would usually expect to find in such an orderly environment. It seemed unlikely to me that such a simple detail could carry enormous weight, but intuition struck me insistently, reminding me that the truth sometimes hides in the smallest things, in what everyone ignores because no one thinks them important. That same intuition led me to request a thorough analysis of the dust I collected from the door frame, and also the residue in that familiar glass, because there was something there, invisible, that the story seemed to hide with exhaustive dedication. The wait for the results became a silent torture. In those days, my mind kept turning, reviewing every word I had heard, every gesture I had observed, every detail that seemed like a piece of a puzzle refusing to fit. The apparent normality in the gentleman's life contrasted with the mystery that was gradually unfolding, revealing a dual plot woven between routine and hidden intention. I couldn't help but wonder what dark force had allowed that unusual poison to find its way into that body, leaving no visible traces, without disturbing the material or emotional order of the place. Each time I returned to the house, the metallic and sweet smell seemed to subtly intensify, play with my senses, and feeling the feeling that this place had been the scene of something much deeper and more sinister than a simple, unexpected death. As I crossed the hallways, I felt like I was heading toward a silent enigma sheltered behind a facade of calm. The closed doors behind drawn curtains seemed to watch me, whispering stories I still could not decipher. It was almost ironic how such a peaceful space could harbor a mystery loaded with shadows, a secret woven with precision and care, but with cracks too small to go unnoticed by someone willing to search patiently. The following days became a game of waiting and discovery. The analyses of the dust and residues arrived with a silent promise of answers, and as the results began to emerge, the story started to twist in unexpected directions. The chemical substance found, initially a mystery, turned out to be an active component of a poison made by uncommon and hard-to-obtain procedures, something that suggested it was no accident. The weight of that revelation added a new layer to the investigation. The presence of a third party, someone with knowledge, access, and a very calculated intention. It was then that I decided to resume the interviews, but this time with a different strategy and a renewed focus. The conversations became more careful, seeking not only concrete answers, but trying to read signs, hesitations the unsaid, as if the truth tried to emerge through silences and evasive glances. The neighbor's silence, which had seemed like mere omission or disinterest before, began to take on new meaning. Some of them appeared uncomfortable talking about the hours when supposedly someone visited the house at odd times, while others seemed to protect something without knowing exactly what. One of the neighbors, an older man who lived right across the street, revealed a key piece that the rest seemed to have omitted. He had heard, on nights close to the death, the barely perceptible sound of hurried footsteps and a voice in a low tone, almost whispering, coming from inside the house. Nothing serious, but out of place, he said. That observation, which seemed minor at first, took shape as evidence when that information was cross-referenced with the analysis of the chemical samples. It wasn't a casual visitor. It was someone who worked in the shadows cautiously and with a motive that went beyond the immediate. I began to dig deeper into the deceased's life, tracing connections that had seemed irrelevant before. The relationship with his nephew, whom until then I had seen as a distant figure, started to take on a peculiar profile. I discovered they had financial and legal differences not visible in public records, disputes over an inheritance and disagreements that, although familial, carried a deep resentment. It wasn't an open hostility or violent conflict, but was a reason strong enough for someone to try to resolve it without leaving visible traces. On the other hand, the gentleman's former business partner, a man whose name had not stood out in the investigation before, appeared on the map with new data, recent legal problems, suspicious money movements, and an evident interest in the deceased's economic life. Putting all these pieces together, the picture began to take a clear and worrisome form. Natural death faded away, replaced by a low-visibility murder, hidden behind a layer of apparent calm and perfection. That discovery not only added pressure to the investigation, but also an ethical and professional challenge to make every decision with precision and care. People's lives were at stake, and the responsibility to establish the truth was both a moral and professional duty. I couldn't fail or let superficial perception gain ground. That feeling accompanied me every step of the way, mixing adrenaline with deep respect. I knew I was unraveling something that could change lives, and reflecting on that reminded me why I had chosen this profession. To give voice to those who could no longer speak, to illuminate the dark, and protect the memory of those who left this world unjustly. The interdisciplinary analysis I conducted together with experts in chemistry and forensic toxicology revealed even more surprising details about the poison. Its complex composition indicated that it had been deliberately mixed to act slowly and discreetly, making detection difficult and leaving a seemingly organic death on the surface. That further ruled out the idea of an accident and pointed to a premeditated, calculated action with exact knowledge of the human body and common forensic techniques. Understanding that level of preparation made me value the importance of meticulous work even more, because one single oversight could have lost that vital clue forever. Sharing these findings with the police and the prosecutor changed course of the investigation. Procedures were initiated to identify and interview people with access to the poison and enough knowledge to handle it without leaving obvious traces. That new phase of the process immersed me in a little-explored world where forensic medicine meets criminal psychology, sociology, and the complex web of human relationships. Investigating, analyzing, and piecing together the story behind that death was not just a technical act. It was also an exercise in empathy, patience, and perseverance. As days turned into weeks, the tension in the atmosphere increased. The previously passive environment now seemed charged with expectations and latent fear. The victim was no longer just a man who had died calmly, but the center of a dark and dangerous web. The fragility of what we believed we understood about death was breaking apart in invisible pieces, and every reconstruction of the event required an extra level of care. In that delicate balance, everything could go wrong if we overlooked a small detail. One night, reviewing the reports and samples again under the lab's dim light, I had a moment of clarity that made me understand the true magnitude of the case. The meticulousness with which the killer acted led me to think of someone who knew not only the victim very well, but also forensic procedures. That idea shook my mind. The fact that the poison was camouflaged in infinitesimal amounts, that the environment had been manipulated to avoid suspicion, and that the crime scene maintained an almost ritual order spoke of a calculating, expert mind. It was not just a crime. It was a message hidden beneath the surface. As I processed that revelation, one name repeatedly came to mind: the nephew, who seemed to have disappeared in the days following the death. The desire to understand what motivated that entire web gripped me with renewed strength. It had started as a routine case and had evolved into a labyrinth of clues, suspicions, and restrained emotions. I held the responsibility to illuminate every dark corner so justice could advance. This was a moment I truly understood that our work in forensic medicine goes far beyond the apparent, that every fragment, every smell, every shadow at the scene can contain the key to the truth, and that although death tries to silence, rigor and patience manage to open those doors we thought closed forever. I couldn't help feeling a mix of admiration and respect for the complexity of life and the secrets we carry within. I learned that in the search for truth, patience is not a weakness but an act of courage, that the smallest details, invisible to many, can transform a simple story into a profound, brutal, and revealing account, and that in this profession, commitment to reality demands firm dedication, an honest gaze, and an untiring will to leave no stone unturned. Even today, when I recount this case, I recreate that silent house, the gentleman's body, and that almost invisible substance that forced me to see beyond, to unravel a truth hidden under layers of superficial calm. That experience became a kind of beacon that lights each of my steps, reminding me that justice is built not only with evident proof, but with meticulous attention to what many do not see, and with the unwavering conviction that the truth always deserves to be rescued from the deepest silence. The days that followed that revelation marked a before and after in the investigation. Something in the air seemed to have thickened even more, as if the case had become a perfect sphere of unknown, slowly but inexorably spinning toward a climax. I kept going back and reviewing every report, every testimony, try to find a connection I hadn't noticed, a detail that could break the apparent impenetrability of the mystery. The house, with its empty rooms and perpetual silence, haunted my thoughts, demanding attention in the form of those microscopic residues, those invisible traces that only reveal themselves under the scrutiny of the laboratory and patience. The nephew's absence became a growing shadow, a figure increasingly clear in my mind as a key piece of the puzzle. He had disappeared right after the gentleman's death, and his absence could not be attributed to chance or mourning. Every clue led me to imagine possible scenarios, from a hasty escape to a calculated strategy to avoid uncomfortable questions. I contacted the police to request an active search, but it was evident that someone had premeditated that move and that behind that disappearance was a more complex network than it seemed. Meanwhile, new data emerged from meticulously reviewed interviews. Not everyone told the whole truth. Some hid information even without realizing it, motivated by fear or protection. A neighbor mentioned, almost in a whisper, that the night before the death, the nephew had had an argument in the nearby park with an unknown man, an exchange loaded with sharp, intense words. This sparked an idea, not only resentment and family conflicts, but a possible link to someone external, someone who might have benefited or been involved in that dark web. I then decided to visit the park that very night. I walked among the shadows, observing the areas where that conversation could have taken place. The place was deserted, only the whisper of the wind rustling fallen leaves. Yet the sensation of presence was intense, as if echoes of unresolved voices and conflicts remained in that landscape. I thought about how fragile truths sometimes are, so delicate that a clandestine conversation is enough to crumble them. I felt part of a silent search, a detective of the invisible who must assemble a full story from scattered fragments and fragmentary testimonies. The investigation led me to explore old family and financial records with the help of a data analysis expert. Clues surfaced showing suspicious money movements linked to the former business partner, but the most disturbing discovery was transfers seemingly funneled through shell companies created within the last year. Was it possible these funds were used to finance more than dubious deals? This raised the hypothesis that the death was not only related to family conflict, but perhaps to broader and more dangerous interests, with a hidden intent that went beyond mere greed. It was in the middle of this tangle that an unexpected voice reappeared. I received a private message from someone who identified themselves only as a witness. They spoke cautiously and assured me they had crucial information about the nephew's disappearance and the true motivations behind it all. We agreed to meet the next day at a discreet cafe, without cameras or witnesses. Upon entering, I saw them sitting in a corner, with a tired expression and eyes that seemed to have seen too much. What they told me confirmed my worst suspicions. There was a web of blackmail, threats, and manipulation involving several people. The nephew was not just fleeing, but trapped in a spider web created to silence him. This witness revealed details about the poison, which was neither common nor easy to obtain. They spoke of its origin in a clandestine laboratory, from someone with knowledge not only of chemistry, but also medicine, capable of designing substances that mimic natural effects on the body. I was surprised to hear that this person, the true perpetrator, had planned the death well in advance to avoid immediate suspicions, ensuring the scene seemed a simple, natural death. The neat order of the house and the absence of obvious signs of violence or struggle now made sense. It was not negligence or coincidence, but part of perfectionist and silent modus operandi of the killer. As I listened, I understood the message was also a warning. The person orchestrating everything had resources, contacts, and an ability to hide that made them dangerous. The pursuit would not be easy, and a simple accusation without solid evidence could turn against those seeking justice. I felt torn between fear and responsibility. That weight on my chest, that feeling of facing something much bigger and darker than an ordinary case. It was clear that the plot was more sophisticated than I had expected, and that every move had to be calculated, every word measured so as not to alert the hidden enemy. I began working more closely with prosecutors and police specialized in complex crimes. We knew the key was to locate the nephew and gather enough evidence to expose the culprit. Every day I requested reports, reviewed footage from cameras near the deceased's house, and other places of interest. In one of those inquiries, I managed to identify a figure matching the nephew's description, entering a mechanic's workshop on the outskirts of the city, a place not previously on our radar. I decided to visit that workshop accompanied by the police. The atmosphere was gloomy and heavy, a space where shadows seemed to grow longer and denser as we advanced. The door creaked open, and the smell of burning oil and metal filled the air. No one answered our calls, but in a corner behind a workbench I saw evidence of a recent presence. Scraps of packaging and tools, among them something that caught my attention, a small bottle with chemical residues matching the poison's composition. At that moment, I realized we were too close, and that the circle was tightening ever more. While we searched carefully, someone watched us from the street. In a swift movement, a figure fled, leaving behind a heightened sense of alert. There was no doubt. The culprit had been warned. The pressure increased, with the certainty that we were in a race against time. Entering the territory where the killer moved with impunity involved a tangible risk, but also a unique opportunity to close the case. I returned to the laboratory with that mixture of urgency and caution in mind. I reviewed the poison analysis again, searching for any element that might indicate additional motives or a characteristic signature of the maker. That was when I noted a detail that had gone unnoticed. A tiny traceability mark, a rare isotope found only in a university laboratory in Montevideo, one the nephew had access to years ago during his academic training. That clue shattered the idea of a purely impulsive or low-level crime. We were dealing with a case stretching between professional and the personal, a tangle woven fiercely and precisely over years. With this latest piece of information, I immediately summoned the prosecutors and met with specialists at the university laboratory. The conversation revealed that those substances were not only exclusive to the site, but were kept under strict control measures and restricted access. Who had the audacity or desperation to steal them? Suspicion returned strongly. Someone close, someone who, besides knowing the techniques, knew how to manipulate them to their advantage for a death that would raise no suspicion. The line between ally and enemy blurred in the shadows. Days later, tension reached a breaking point with the unexpected arrest of a healthcare professional, a chemist with hidden backgrounds and connections to the old business partners network. His interrogation revealed cracks in alibis, but most revealing was how the pieces of that puzzle began to fit together with disturbing clarity. The relationship between the chemist, the partner, and the nephew became clearer. A betrayal involving power, money, and a macabre game of manipulation where each tried to protect themselves and blame the other. That death, which at first glance seemed natural, was now the epicenter of a network of deceit as complex as it was ruthless. And yet, the nephew remained missing, his figure an unresolved enigma, as if fate itself wanted to keep him hidden until the very last moment. The interrogations and searches still hadn't caught him, and his silence fed both the mystery and the urgency to resolve what was at stake. In every conversation, every step of the process, the feeling grew. We were approaching an ending that would bring not only answers, but also open wounds and revelations that would resonate far beyond that silent house. Amid that uncertainty, one night, while reviewing security recordings once again, I noticed a detail no one had mentioned. A fleeting shadow, barely perceptible, crossing the street behind the house in the early morning after the death. It was someone who, unlike the nephew, was not trying to hide, but moved with the confidence of someone who controls the scene from the shadows. That figure, who never stopped to watch or interact with anyone, made me realize I was not alone in this plot, that invisible actors were pulling the strings, and that the outcome would be darker and deeper than I ever imagined. That was when I understood this case was, in many ways, a dark mirror of the human condition, where knowledge and coexistence can be used to create death disguised as naturality, where private ambitions can justify the destruction of family bonds, where truth hides in layers invisible to the naked eye, waiting to be exposed by a gaze that refuses to give up. That night I knew for sure that justice, to come to the surface, needed more than evidence. It required unwavering will and the courage to always look beyond the silence. And so, with the heavy burden of uncertainty and hope intertwined, I turned off the lights in the laboratory, aware that this case, which at first seemed simple and fleeting, had trapped me forever in the complex web that binds death, truth, and justice in a relentless and revealing dance. The figure in the recording had moved with an unsettling certainty, and that certainty, rather than giving me peace, triggered a silent alarm within me. It wasn't an ordinary person, nor someone who happened to be lost in the anonymity of the night by chance. It was an actor who knew their role perfectly, someone who had control and time to exercise it without any fear of being discovered. After all, in this story, fear and guilt seemed to be on the same team, but power was not. Power, on the contrary, stepped firmly, invisible but incisive. From that moment on, I felt how every step, every discovery, was under surveillance, even if indirectly. It wasn't just a matter of police, prosecutors, or experts. It was a dance with much more elusive forces. That presence among the shadows challenged us, set the rhythm, and forced us to be more cautious, to weigh every move. What began as a simple forensic investigation had turned into a chess game where every piece could be the key, but also a trap. It was in that oppressive atmosphere, with the awareness of always watching and being watched, that I decided it was necessary to turn to less conventional sources. I began to contact people who, because of their closeness to the case or previous experience in similar situations, could offer a fresh perspective, perhaps removed from the formality and rigidity that sometimes impoverishes instinct. Intuition, that sixth sense that in forensic medicine can make the difference between overlooking a crucial detail or solving a mystery, became my most faithful ally. An old journalist, known for her ability to connect invisible dots in difficult cases, agreed to meet with me. It was a long and silent conversation, full of pauses and glances that seemed to seek more than words. We talked about the hidden dynamics of Montevideo, about how certain circles of power can shape reality as much as a laboratory can manipulate a chemical supply. According to her, the nephew, beyond being a victim and fugitive, had become an uncomfortable symbol for some, someone who knew secrets that, if revealed, would affect more than material goods. They would endanger reputations, privileges, and even the security of certain powerful people. This led me to review with a new approach clues I had seemed to discard. For example, an encrypted message found on the elderly man's phone, which after deeper analysis was not a simple meaningless alphanumeric code, but the way several involved parties communicated internally. With decoding tools and joint work with experts in digital communications, we managed to decipher fragments pointing to clandestine meetings and financial movements much broader than initially suspected. The web was so complex it seemed woven with almost perfect procedures to avoid falling into hands of the law or curious eyes. An unexpected twist came when, thanks to this decryption, we located a place, a warehouse on the outskirts of Montevideo that had gone unnoticed until then. Visiting it with the police, we found documents, USBs, and other digital objects that probably contained decisive evidence. However, tension was not lacking in the middle of the find. On the table lay a note, a tacit challenge. We knew we were entering a dangerous network, and that someone was watching every move. The warning was clear and subtle but powerful in its influence. Retreat was an option that seemed increasingly distant. The most unsettling thing was that while we advanced, the nephew remained a ghost. No recent clue had brought him closer even to a concrete location possibility, and we increasingly felt the pressure of time. It was as if he himself was aware that surrounding him was the first step towards sinking into a dangerous abyss, and that playing invisible was his only hope of survival. At the same time, I couldn't stop thinking about what he really knew. What was the truth he carried with him and that others feared so much? That added a layer of emotional complexity to the case, because the nephew ceased to be just a suspect or a piece in the game. He became someone who had lived firsthand the threat and isolation. I then decided to visit the missing man's wife, seeking to delve into the intimate environment, into those small details that often escape official investigations but harbor unsuspected truths. The house, modest and tidy, seemed a refuge of memories, as well as a place charged with deep tensions. In a conversation that swung between shyness and despair, she confessed that certain disputes between her husband and the nephew were not only about money or business, but about ethical principles, about loyalties and confessions made in secrecy. That made me rethink how, in forensic cases, death is barely the visible final point of a much more intricate story. Exploring those human layers was as important or more so than following physical traces. Because behind the laboratory, the poison, the financial transfers, there were motivations, fears, and decisions that had marked an irreversible path. Understanding that also allowed understanding the killer's logic, their method, and planning. The perfection of the scene was not the result of chance, but a conviction of someone who believes they are doing justice in their own way, even if they lose all humanity in the process. Amid all this, we received unexpected information. Someone had seen the nephew in a small, distant town where he supposedly had no contacts or reasons to go. That clue led us to expand the search, incorporating new technologies, drones, and covert surveillance that gave the team a different, almost cinematic dimension. The combination of classic forensic work with modern tools kept us one step ahead. although the adversary also seemed to adapt quickly. During one of those surveillances, the nephew's figure appeared on the scene, but not as a desperate fugitive, rather calculating every move, every contact with the precision of a man who knew that the slightest mistake would mean his capture or worse. Seeing him from afar, in the shadows, allowed me to understand that his silence was a form of resistance, and that even without words, the truth he carried could change everything if he ever decided to appear. Little by little, the collected testimonies, the unalterable scientific evidence, and an emotional map of the relationships among those involved began to draw a complex, human portrait, full of contradictions and personal tragedies. We found that the key to the murder was not only a matter of greed or revenge, but a deep clash between ideals, secrets, and fears that had been beating for years inside a family marked by distrust and silence. That night, while reviewing the reports one last time, I knew that far from improving, the case was at its most delicate point. Justice, the one I had always thought attainable through cold, meticulous analysis, had reached its limit, the ground where science mixes with human uncertainty, and where the real challenge is not only finding the culprit, but understanding why it happened. The truth is not just a matter of facts, but also of hearts and cruel echoes that drag the living, carrying the weight of those who left without clear answers. Uncertainty weighed heavily, but so did the certainty that every small detail, every shadow, every silence, was a message waiting to be read. Because in life, and especially in death, sometimes answers don't come as we imagine, and justice is not an end point but an inevitable path, full of complications and pain, but also of hope for those who dare to seek it even in the darkest places. I saved the files, turned off the laboratory light, and closed the door with the awareness that this case, the most complicated so far, had not only changed my way of facing forensic medicine, but also my perspective on what it means to seek the truth. Sometimes the answer lies in patience. Other times, in the courage to look back and forward at the same time. And inside me, I knew that even if the road was arduous and full of dangers, every step would be worth it, because behind death, I learned that life, with all its contradictions and secrets, deserves to be discovered until the last breath. What happened afterwards showed me that even when we thought we had control over every fragment of the investigation, there was always something or someone who got ahead, recalibrated the game, and turned every certainty into a new question. After surveillance in that small town, the next move was to follow the trail of the nephew's contacts. It turned out he was neither alone nor working in isolation, but had created a small yet efficient circle. People who seemed ordinary on the surface but, upon closer inspection, were part of a much deeper network than we could have imagined. The appearance of messengers, facilitators, and accomplices radically changed the perception of the case. It was not just a family dispute that ended in tragedy, but the tip of a much darker iceberg. One thing I learned that day is that patience in these cases is not only a virtue, but a strategy. The anxiety to move quickly to close conclusions can be the best ally of those who seek to hide the truth. That is why I accompany the agents in shadowing, listening to conversations, and dissecting digital profiles with the same thoroughness with which one analyzes a tissue sample in the laboratory. Every piece of data, no matter how small or insignificant it seemed, could be the key to opening a door locked tight with key and padlock. One early morning, after days of silent inquiries, the signal we needed arrived. A meeting marked at a downtown cafe, a spot that had gone unnoticed due to its apparent ordinary nature. Two of the main suspects linked to the irregular movements we had detected would meet there. The operation was meticulous. Each of us understood the importance of not raising suspicion, while at the same time not missing a single detail. While I reviewed the preliminary recordings, the agents prepared to intervene if an emergency arose. What we heard stunned us for a moment. In those few broken words, in that exchange of tense glances, it was clear that we were not only facing a criminal circle, but a network of blackmail and deception that extended beyond the elderly man's family. There were implications touching local politics, economic interests of considerable magnitude, and, finally, a web of complicities that seemed to encompass authorities as well as people close to the victim, even though the latter were far from imagining how their actions might be complicit in the tragedy. This revelation increased the pressure, as well as the risk, but we could not let fear paralyze us. On the contrary, that fear became the fuel to redouble our efforts, to look beyond, to connect the pieces that intelligence and forensic science were delivering with heartbreaking precision. It was in this context of growing tension that I received a confidential message, an unexpected invitation to a meeting with an informant who claimed to have irrefutable evidence in hand. However, I knew that in this game everything could be a trap, and that the thin line between truth and lie could break at any moment. The chosen place was a little frequented park in a residential area. There, the informant appeared with an envelope containing photographs, documents, and audio recordings. Among this evidence were statements implicating seemingly untouchable individuals, orders, signs of bribery, and even threatening messages sent to the nephew, confirming that his silence and absence were not a coincidence but the result of a real and profound fear. That envelope was much more than a set of proofs. It was a key to dismantle a corrupt system and understand why that death, which seemed simple at first glance, was a visible link in a long chain of deceptions. However, what came next was not easy. Every advance seemed to trigger a violent reaction in the shadows. Our unit was a target of sabotage attempts, intercepted communications, and veiled warnings. There came a time when we realized that the enemy was not only outside, but also that there were those within the system who preferred the case not to move forward, that the certainties remained buried under heaps of papers and legal excuses. Amid hundreds of files and pieces of evidence, the feeling was unpleasant, a mixture of frustration and bewilderment that pushed us to wonder who we could really trust. But the nature of forensic work, and perhaps human stubbornness for justice, led us to innovate once more. We worked with image analysis experts to verify the authenticity of videos and photographs, resorted to digital forensic analysis techniques that allowed us to track document manipulation and find the real authors of fraudulent communications. We also contacted behavioral analysis experts to interpret certain patterns a nephew had inadvertently left behind, such as emotional traces in unanswered messages and inexplicable movements that, at first glance, seemed random but made sense when combined with the information gathered. It was amid this intense crescendo that something happened that changed my perspective on everything I had experienced up to that moment. A finding hidden behind a series of coincidences led to the discovery of a forgotten safety deposit box containing no less than the nephew's written statement, delivered months before he disappeared. That text was a bombshell. In it, with astonishing clarity, he broke the wall of silence that had surrounded the case and detailed everything he knew, the threats he received, the family conflicts, and the larger implications we were now unraveling. There, for the first time, the story had a voiceover narrator, a witness who, although absent, spoke strongly and clearly to those willing to listen. This document, however, was not only a confession, it was tangible proof against a network that had been woven over years. It revealed names, dates, and cover-up mechanisms that challenged those who believed themselves untouchable. Reading it left me with mixed feelings. On one hand, profound sadness for what could not be prevented or protected, and on the other, the certainty that the truth, though incomplete, was beginning to emerge in the shadows with a force no one could ignore. The following days became a race against time and uncertainty. The invisible power feeling out every move, would it operate with such sophistication, now use intimidation in its purest form. Nevertheless, no threat, no attempt to discredit the painstaking and proven work could extinguish the flame we had ignited. The task was no longer just scientific analysis, but an act of courage, a realization that behind every piece of evidence there are lives at stake, people seeking justice beyond the cold official paperwork. In that context, I decided that to close this chapter was essential to hold a public act, presenting everything with transparency and confidence that the truth, though painful, was the only possible path to repair. In a room full of journalists, authorities, and the victims' relatives, exposing every detail with a precision only forensic rigor allows, the story began to take on another dimension. It was no longer just a death, but the illustrated portrait of a fragmented system that had allowed the tragedy to unfold and be hidden under layers of impunity. While making that presentation, I felt inside me the strange mix between professional satisfaction at having deciphered the code and the enormous responsibility that, right there at that moment, I was laying many lives bare to the public. I knew the public's reaction, and above all those implicated, would be a whirlwind. But I also knew it was a necessary step, that opening wounds, no matter how painful, would be the only way to begin reconstruction, to restore trust among those who believed justice was just an empty word. And the truth, my friend, is that in this profession one faces moments like these, where science and humanity are not separate worlds, but inseparable parts of the same fabric. Because, in the end, what drives us is not just uncovering how a person died, but understanding why and what we can learn so something like this never happens again. That responsibility always accompanies me, reminding me that behind every case beats a human story, and that only with respect, patience, and firmness can the disconnected pieces reveal their full meaning. Closing that day, I was aware that although the investigation was far from over, something had changed completely. The story had ceased to be just a closed file on a desk and had become an urgent call to look beyond, to question what seemed immutable, to refuse to accept that truth is a luxury reserved for few. Because in forensics, as in life, justice is never a straight or easy path, but always deserves to be sought, with eyes fixed on the humanity the case contains, certain that behind every death there is a lesson that, if we learn to listen to it, can change everything. So here I am, with my conscience shattered, but also with hope intact, because I learned that looking closely, listening patiently, and persisting bravely is the only way to unravel the secrets that, although they want to remain hidden, always end up revealing themselves to those who are not afraid to face them. And that, for me, was the most valuable lesson of this case that I will never forget, and that changed not only one family's story, but mine as a forensic doctor. The night we decided to make the truth public, the city seemed to hold its breath. The tension accumulated over weeks was palpable in the air, like a storm ready to break, and I felt a weight beyond time and exhaustion. Coming down from the stage after the conference, while the flashes of the cameras still mingled with the murmur of an audience thirsty for justice, I knew that what we had uncovered was not just a dark chapter for family, but an open wound that reached the entire community. But what came next was even more unexpected. Reactions were not limited to indignation or solidarity. Subtle, almost imperceptible forms of resistance also arose. In the following weeks, anonymous messages began appearing on social media dismissing the report, calling it a conspiracy, and manipulated versions started leaking with the intent to discredit those involved in the investigation. At that moment, I understood that the battle was no longer fought only in laboratories or interrogation rooms, but in the collective mind of the people, in public opinion, where truth can be shaped or destroyed with equal ease. I then felt how each piece of evidence presented could become a double-edged sword. On one hand, it fed the hope for justice and transparency. On the other, it opened the door to discursive violence and paralyzing fear. It was like walking on a tightrope, aware that a single misstep could topple years of work and turn even the most steadfast person into a victim of doubts and attacks. However, it was not time to retreat, but to move forward with more caution and strength, knowing that, no matter how small, every crack we opened in the wall of lies was an invaluable achievement. It was then that the investigation took an unexpected turn. A trusted agent, someone from my closest circle, informed me that he had detected strange movements in one of the key documents. At first, it seemed like an administrative error, but more thorough review confirmed what none of us wanted to believe. Someone had tried to alter the evidence, change dates, erase names, and blur responsibilities. The betrayal did not come only from outside. It lurked in the shadows of those who supposedly shared the same commitment to the truth. This discovery shook the foundations of the investigation and forced us to rethink strategies. Aware of the danger this represented, we reinforced security measures and doubled down on internal controls. But I also understood that distrust, although bitter, was a sign that we were touching on something much deeper and rooted than we had imagined. The struggle had become a fight not only against visible crime, but against an invisible network of interests seeking to keep a corrupt system intact. And I, as a forensic expert, had become a key link to unravel that complex web, but also a target desired by those who preferred the lights never be turned on. Shortly after, a call alerted me about an anonymous package that had arrived at the office. Inside were a series of documents complementing the evidence, including recordings that showed clandestine meetings where bribes were discussed and direct threats were made against a nephew and some witnesses. But the most chilling was an audio recording where a voice, relentless and without remorse, described the entire operation in detail. Listening to those words was like looking into the eyes of naked truth, But it was also a harsh blow because it meant we were facing enemies willing to do anything to protect themselves. That night, I couldn't sleep. Thoughts mingled with uncertainty and mounting pressure. I knew the public exposure of the case had helped make it visible, but also put at risk those of us fighting for justice from within. Every step forward required more courage, more resilience, and a clear awareness that protecting the evidence and the people involved was fundamental. It was a delicate balance between advancing and not losing those who, out of fear or conviction, could be the key to closing the circle. However, forensic science, with all its demands and precision, remained our best ally in sustaining the fight. Through the analysis of microscopic patterns, of almost invisible chemical elements, we were able to establish connections that had gone unnoticed by the initial investigators. For example, at one of the crime scenes, a tiny trace of compound rare in the country became the piece that linked one of the suspects to the scene, collapsing alibis and exposing hidden collaborations. At those moments, I knew that even if lies try to disguise themselves with 1,000 masks, truth always leaves a mark that science can uncover. As we advanced, the story became more complex and painful. The network of those implicated expanded, and with it, the emotional impact on the families and on us as a team. We could feel the social and political pressure they wanted to exert on the case, but also the ethical weight of staying firm in the search, refusing to bend to threats or concessions. In a profession like ours, I learned that the commitment to truth is an invisible pact that binds us beyond any difficulty, and that we are the guardians of the memory and justice that the victims deserve. It was during those exhausting weeks that a new figure appeared in the investigation, someone who had remained silent until then, a former employee of the victim, who provided crucial details about unusual activities and financial movements that did not fit the official story. His testimony, although initially mistrusted, opened an unexpected window into the economic dimension of the case, revealing a network of money laundering and influence peddling. Every piece of information he provided was like a mirror reflecting a darker reality, and little by little it added pieces to a puzzle that seemed endless. But with every advance, the pressure also intensified. Many times I felt that my body and mind demanded a pause, that fatigue was winning, and that uncertainty could overcome the desire for justice. However, the memory of the victim, of their story and what they represented for their community, pushed me not to give in. In those difficult moments, it is when the passion for truth and commitment to humanity become the invisible engine that holds you up, that engine which, despite everything, reminds you that what you do is greater than tiredness or adversity. One dawn, while reviewing the final analyses once more, an email left me breathless. It was an attachment with new satellite images showing clandestine movements at a nearby port, linked to one of the suspects who until then had stayed off the radar. This confirmed that the network operated with greater sophistication than we had anticipated, connecting illicit businesses with public officials and influential figures. I knew this revelation would shake the foundations of local power, and therefore the battle would continue to be arduous, but also that we were closer than ever to dismantling that perverse machinery. That morning, as the first rays of sun came to the laboratory window, I felt that all the effort and sacrifice were beginning to make sense. We had managed to turn minimal evidence, which had seemed insignificant at first, into the cornerstone for changing a story of deception and pain. And although the road would be long and fraught with obstacles, I knew we were leaving a deep mark that neither corruption nor fear could erase. Reflecting on all that had happened, I realized that forensic work is not just technique or science. It is also sensitivity, intuition, and humanity. It is the ability to look beyond the facts, to respectfully listen to the silent voices, to not fear the darkness because we know that in it the truth waits patiently to be found. And that lesson, the one I learned day by day as we unraveled this case that seemed like a simple story but ended up being a broken mirror of our own society, is the one I carry with me and hope will inspire those who someday face mysteries hidden beneath layers of silence. So, as I close this chapter, I cannot help but think that, despite everything, justice is not just an abstract ideal but a shared responsibility that begins with those who dare to look, question, and persist until every small detail shines with the truth it deserves. That is the most valuable legacy this case left, and the reason why, no matter how difficult the road, there will always be hope to rebuild the stories that deserve to be told. The reality we face began to reveal its many faces. Each time we thought we had hit rock bottom, a new layer emerged, an unexpected detail that complicated the plot even further and demanded more attentive, almost obsessive gaze. The investigation had ceased to be a mere succession of evidence and reports to become a puzzle upon whose fitting not only justice for the victim depended, but the integrity of an entire system that we seemed close to toppling. We lived in a kind of tense calm, a suspended moment where every move could trigger reactions that would upheave not only the case but our own lives. What once seemed an isolated matter had transformed into a knot of crossed interests involving politicians and businessmen alike, with all their invisible tentacles touching the shadows of corruption. These new elements were not just figures or documents. They were stories, perhaps truncated or silenced, that suddenly found space to manifest amid the chaos. Yet, this revelation brought no relief, only the bitter certainty that the enemy was more powerful and more deeply rooted than we could have imagined. I remember entire nights when exhaustion crossed paths with anxiety as we reviewed recordings, financial reports, and statements over and over, searching for something that might at first seem irrelevant but contained a definitive clue. It was then, amid that mountain of information, that something was discovered which for many would have gone unnoticed. A name repeated almost inadvertently in several documents, an intermediary who seemed to operate in the shadows, moving pieces without leaving a visible trace. This figure, identified as a businessman with connections in both spheres, began to take shape as a possible link between the illegal world and official power. This finding marked a turning point. Interviews with witnesses who had previously been elusive and unclear began to form an increasingly solid narrative. Those who, out of fear or loyalty, had kept silent now found support and protection implemented by the team to open up with small fragments of their truth. Each testimony, although fragmented and sometimes contradictory, fit into a pattern that showed us a network where the boundaries between victim and perpetrators blurred in a game of interests and betrayals. But warnings and pressures also intensified. The atmosphere became more hostile, and every meeting, every exchange of information was tinged with suspicion that we were being watched or even infiltrated. In this context, trust became a scarce resource, and I had to learn to be more cautious with whom I shared details, even within the team. Paranoia seemed a luxury I could not afford, but reality forced me to balance prudence with a need to move forward without losing my grip or hope. The tension reached its peak when, during one of those nightly analysis sessions, an unexpected piece of evidence appeared. A small notebook, hidden in an unlikely place inside the victim's house, containing encoded notes. At first, we did not understand its meaning because they seemed like meaningless scribbles, scattered dates, names and numbers intertwined with strange symbols. However, with the help of a cryptography expert, we partially deciphered the content. What emerged was a list of meetings and transactions, references to bribes and hidden payments, and also names we had never directly associated with the case. It was a powerful blow. It was like holding in our hands a sheet that, although wrapped in mystery, connected the loose pieces and gave shape to a more overwhelming truth. What was curious was that the notebook seemed personal, almost a secret log of someone who, from within, had wanted to leave a testimony. The question that hovered and no one dared to answer aloud was, who had had the courage to document that network of corruption and betrayal? And more importantly, what had happened to that person? It was a mystery added to the already convoluted plot, opening an unexplored door into the motives and consequences of it all. With this new information in hand, the team intensified its work, seeking connections that confirmed every detail with scientific and solid testimonial support. At the same time, political pressure did not disappear. On the contrary, it became more sophisticated, with maneuvers aimed at discrediting any progress, sowing doubt in the media, and dividing the team. The wear was evident, and the media attacks hurt as much as the direct threats. Feeling the weight of public burden was a difficult experience to handle, especially because we were aware that behind many words lives were at stake. Amid that whirlwind, there was an episode that, for me, was revealing. During a brief trip to present a report at a judicial hearing, I was approached during a break by a person who until then had remained on the sidelines, almost invisible, someone working in public administration who decided to trust me with a warning. He told me not to trust any official documents presented so far, that within the system there were active people protecting the guilty, but also a resistance, a small group willing to support the truth from within. Those words made me understand the depth of the clash we were facing. It was not only an external struggle, but a battle marked by cracks and internal fractures, in a network extending far beyond the initial scene. That day I returned with a feeling that, in reality, we were trapped in a gigantic web, where every thread we touched responded to a different interest. But I also understood that this knowledge was a strength because it allowed us to anticipate moves and prepare a firm defense to preserve the integrity of the process. It was necessary to be one step ahead, even when it seemed that darkness imposed its law, because we knew, without a doubt, that only the truth, exposed with irrefutable evidence, could open the way to real change. As we advanced, a detail that at first seemed minor began to take center stage: the victim's nephew's path. His story, marked by difficulties and contradictions, had initially been presented as a solid alibi, but soon his ambiguous attitude and inconsistencies in his statements generated more suspicion than certainties. Through discreet interviews and behavior analysis, we found signs of a much more active involvement than had been publicly acknowledged. It was evident that the young man was at a complex crossroads, caught between fear and family pressure, and perhaps carrying secrets he had yet to reveal. The need to protect him became a priority. We understood that without his cooperation, the investigation could stall or even backslide. Therefore, together with psychologists and specialized lawyers, we designed a secure and confidential channel for him to express himself without fear of reprisals. The process was not easy. There were tense moments, silences that seemed like contained screams, and a palpable internal struggle in every meeting. But little by little, that delicate support network began opening paths of truth, painful as it was, to emerge more clearly. In one of those meetings, the nephew told us, with a voice broken by emotion, how he had been threatened to keep silent, how he had been offered money and protection in exchange for his silence, and how he had come to feel his own life was at risk. It was a testimony that not only provided key information to understand the dynamics of the events, but also humanized the story, reminding us that behind every case there are people with fears, hopes, and dilemmas. This revelation deepened the understanding of the criminal network and reinforced our conviction that justice must reach all involved without exceptions. From there, the pieces fit together more strongly. Collaboration between different areas, from forensics to the prosecution, including cybersecurity and financial analysis experts, allowed us to unravel a complex and perverse network. It was a meticulous process, slow in its advance, thorough in seeking clues, and careful in handling information. We knew that any mistake could be fatal, that the hours invested in verifying every detail were a shield against manipulation, and that the balance between patience and urgency was key to maintaining the coherence of the investigation. I will never forget one of those days in a laboratory when, after weeks of tests, we received an unexpected notification: a partial genetic match in a sample found at the crime scene with an international database. It was data that could open a window to possible foreign connections, broaden the scope of the investigation, and reveal a global dimension to the case. The news surprised and impressed us because it confirmed that the corruption network knew no borders, and that we had touched a limit that transcended the local. Immediately, we initiated contacts with international agencies to share information and coordinate actions, aware that we were facing something of great magnitude. While the investigation crossed those new horizons, media pressure remained, increasingly intense and fragmented. Debates on social media reflected a divided community. Some supported the tireless search for truth, others questioned the methods, and a third group sowed doubt, fueling opposing narratives. Amid this noise, the team had to stay focused, avoiding distractions and concentrating on one goal: that justice prevail beyond political, economic, or media interests. There came a crucial moment when I received an unexpected call. It was from a well-known journalist, someone who had followed the investigation closely, but from a distance. He wanted to interview us, not for sensationalism, but with the intention of delving into the human story behind the evidence, the commitment and challenge we face as a team. That conversation reminded me that, despite all the difficulties and threats, our work had a much broader impact, not only on the victims or the judicial system, but on the collective conscience of society. It was the opportunity to carry the message that truth matters, that no detail is too small nor evidence insignificant when justice is at stake. Thinking about everything that had happened up to that moment stirred a mixture of emotions in me. Pride in what had been achieved, sadness of human cost, and fear for what might still come. But there was also a firm conviction, an inner voice whispering that integrity and perseverance were the only weapons with which we could face so much darkness. It was not an easy or quick battle, but the foundations were already laid, solid evidence, unexpected allies, and an unwavering commitment to the right to truth. As the investigation neared its definitive conclusions, I became aware that this case would leave an indelible mark on my career and my life. We had started with minimal evidence, almost unnoticed, and turned it into the key to dismantling a complex and deep network, a small light in the darkness that had illuminated not only a crime, but the system in which we lived, a light that, although faint, was born from the insistence on leaving no detail unexplored, trust in science, and, above all, the courage to face uncomfortable truths. Now, as I tell this story, I know there are still chapters to write, that the struggle continues, and that justice is a path never fully traveled. But I also know that every step taken, every secret revealed, brings us a little closer to that society where truth is not a luxury, but a right for all. And although sometimes the shadow seems larger, there will always be room for the light of evidence and the voice of those who dare to seek it, because truth, in the end, is the legacy we are capable of leaving. From that moment on, I knew that nothing would be easy or predictable. Every breakthrough brought with it a new complication, an obstacle that seemed to arise just when we were sure we were close to a conclusion. Sleepless nights became part of the usual landscape, just like the mix of anxiety and determination that accompanied me every step of the way. Sometimes, as I mentally reviewed the evidence in order, I wondered if we would truly understand all the implications of what we were unraveling. It was as if we were digging up an old but still vivid secret, one far from being closed or resolved. The deciphered notebook became our compass, the map that guided our investigation for weeks. However, the symbols and codes were not just numbers. Behind them lay the rawest human reality, conflicting interests, broken pacts, fear, and latent violence. I clearly remember a note that, at first glance, was a date followed by some initials, but we soon understood it indicated an irregular financial transfer linked to a shell company. That finding led us to thoroughly review documents and bank records, where we found transactions with suspicious amounts that could only correspond to some laundering or bribery mechanism. Just when the case seemed to be advancing steadily, we began to realize that certain material resources we requested for analyses or follow-ups disappeared, or were delayed without justification. And these were no simple logistical failures. Someone inside the system was intervening to hinder the process. That feeling of being watched and blocked was not only frustrating, but also increased personal risk, which led us to strengthen security protocols and even change certain procedures to protect the integrity of the investigation and the team. In that context, sharing information became complicated. We had to find a balance between being transparent and cautious, because revealing too many details could endanger witnesses or ourselves. The pressure to maintain confidentiality contrasted with the need to move forward and find allies outside the closest circle. And then, an unexpected contact appeared. Someone from the judicial system who seemed willing to help without seeking the spotlight, warning us of possible legal maneuvers that some involved parties were preparing to dismiss or water down the evidence. It was a decisive moment because it made us aware that the enemy not only acted in the shadows, but also knew the rules to use the system to their advantage. That reminder forced us to redouble our efforts to consolidate the chain of custody of the evidence, maintain exhaustive records of everything done, and anticipate every possible defense strategy that those involved might employ. It was a game of anticipation and resistance, where faith in the process was constantly put to the test. Meanwhile, on a personal level, the relationship with the victim's nephew evolved slowly. Sessions with psychologists and lawyers created a safe space where he could trust and open up. His account gradually filled with unsettling details: how he had witnessed secret meetings in the family home, how the visitors were not always those officially reported, and how on several occasions his uncle had expressed fear without specifying exactly what was about. The information he provided not only clarified unknowns, but also confirmed that the crime was linked to something much bigger than a simple personal or family feud. With all these elements on the table, The team decided to conduct a multidisciplinary analysis where digital security experts began tracing electronic communications that could connect those involved. From those investigations emerged encrypted messages that evidenced plans to manipulate testimonies and coerce certain individuals. Little by little, an organized network was uncovered to protect hidden interests and cover up critical evidence. The dimension of the network surprised us. Not isolated people, but entire groups collaborating to maintain a status quo stained by corruption. I remember that, amidst that investigative whirlwind, there was a particularly revealing moment. One dawn, a sample arrived at a lab that initially seemed routine, a tissue found under a table in the victim's house. But the genetic analysis yielded an unexpected result. Partial matches with international data that led us to a neighboring country. That revelation expanded the case to a transnational level and involved coordination with agencies from other countries. It was a blow to our initial vision. What seemed like a local incident turned out to be a piece within a much more complex machinery, with ramifications crossing borders. The challenge then grew exponentially. We had to compete not only with entrenched local interests, but also with foreign structures, which meant managing international protocols, diplomatic language, and new variables that challenged us to act with utmost precision. It was an exhausting time where every step had to be calculated extremely carefully to avoid losing credibility or risking cooperation among the involved entities. Internal politics mixed with diplomacy, and at times I felt like I was in the middle of a board game where every piece could trigger an unpredictable domino effect. At the same time, media pressure increased. Some outlets focused on certain angles of the case, casting doubt on the team's ability or stirring media controversies that distracted from what really mattered. Social networks filled with conflicting opinions, premature judgments, and conspiracy theories that complicated public perception. We felt that, more than informing, some platforms had become channels to obstruct the investigation, where truth was masked by rumors and misinformation. That made us value even more the importance of being clear and rigorous in every public report and in the information we chose to share with the community. One afternoon, while reviewing some documents in my office, I received an encrypted message from an unknown sender. The text was short but chilling. "Everything is closer than you think. Don't let your guard down." That anonymous note put me on alert, but at the same time pushed me not to give up. There were voices, like that one, which, though hidden, shared our conviction that we had to get to the bottom of the matter. It was a reminder that truth can have invisible allies, and that the team's strength came not only from scientific rigor, but from the common will to fight impunity. Weeks passed. Finally, in a strategic meeting with the whole team, we managed to synchronize every piece collected: testimonies, documents, digital records, scientific evidence, and financial analyses. That day, we breathed a different air. We had built a solid narrative, a coherent and well-supported story that clearly exposed a network of corrupt interests and their relation to the elder's murder. Although there was still a long way to go, we had something valuable that many had underestimated from the start: irrefutable evidence. At that moment, I thought about the importance of patient and meticulous work, about how a simple mark on an object or a forgotten note could become the thread that unraveled a complicated knot. What impacted me most was that behind every piece of data, every analysis, there were people who had trusted us, who had risked their safety, so that truth could prevail. And I also remember human fragility, the vulnerability of those trapped in this web, including those who, out of fear, had kept silent until then. That awareness renewed my commitment and that of the entire team to justice and transparency. We knew it was our duty not only to find the truth, but to protect it, to make it visible and accessible, because only then could we prevent stories like this from repeating. The work of the forensic doctor, often perceived only at the crime's final moment, here transformed into the engine that could drive profound change, transcending a single case to affect society as a whole. I can't help but think of the elder, that person who, without knowing it, had left evidence that challenged silence and indifference. That minimal evidence, almost insignificant at first, with patience and perseverance showed us that justice is not an instant act, but a hard path, and that truth has an unimaginable power to break cycles of corruption and abuse. That lesson will always accompany me, reminding me that we cannot give up, because in every case, no matter how small or complex it seems, Truth is a light that must be found and protected. For now, this is where I pause, because the story is still alive, because I know that any moment another detail, another clue can arise, and because that is the heart of our work. We don't give up. We leave no stone unturned. We don't forget that justice is a long path full of challenges. But I also know that as long as we keep a watchful eye and a firm commitment, we can change not only the fate of a case, but the course of an entire society. And that is a truth worth defending, a truth that each one of us has the power to seek and protect. As we progressed, each new discovery seemed to intertwine in ways that challenged our initial understanding and forced us to rethink everything we believed we knew. There were moments when the investigation seemed to advance steadily, almost mechanically, while at other times, everything collapsed before us like houses of cards. One early morning, while reviewing reports and meticulously analyzing every detail of the intercepted communications, I came across a small audio file that, unknowingly, ended up triggering a chain of events that completely changed the perspective of the case. The voice was barely audible, just a whisper, but it contained words that, when combined with what we had already uncovered, led us to suspect a much broader complicity within the very institutions that were supposed to guarantee justice. The main question began to change. It was no longer just about who had committed the violent act, but who had woven a network to keep that secret intact, manipulating evidence, delaying procedures, and tamper with testimonies to uphold a broken system. The disturbing part was when we were able to verify that some of the most important documents, which seemed to be key pieces of the trial, had been digitally altered in a subtle job, but with technical errors that only a trained team could detect. This brought us closer to the idea that we were facing a systematic operation with assigned roles and perhaps ideological, political, or economic motivations beyond our initial imagination. At that moment, I realized that to unravel that tangle, the team needed to move with extreme caution. No one was exempt from suspicion, and every misstep could mean the irreversible loss of evidence or, worse, endanger the lives of those involved. The internal tension grew, not only because of what the case implied, but because of the pressure we felt knowing that there could be serious personal consequences in that struggle. It was then that the conversations within the team stopped being just technical. We began talking about fear, uncertainty, and the strength each one needed to find to continue. It was a delicate balance, where weariness was felt in every glance, in the pause to reply to a message, in silences that became denser than usual. There was one particularly tough night. I received a call from a rather unsettled colleague, with his voice barely contained, warning me that suspicious movements had been detected near the home of one of the protected witnesses. The feeling of vulnerability increased even more. We took immediate measures to strengthen security and ensure the investigation continued uninterrupted. But the message was clear. Not only was there a network of corruption, but also a latent threat that wanted to silence the search for truth. That night was one of those in which I stayed awake staring at the ceiling, wondering if we had noticed everything, if we could trust a few allies we deemed trustworthy, and above all, if what we were doing would make any difference in a system so affected by interests and fears. Despite this, something inside me refused to succumb. I remembered the promise I made when I chose this profession, to give a voice to those who no longer have one, and to defend those forgotten by indifference. Behind every piece of evidence was a face, a story, and I could not allow that effort to be in vain. That conviction led us to go beyond the obvious, to desperately but patiently search for every inconsistency, every shadow that others had left unattended. Gradually, we also learned to communicate what we discovered, not with fanaticism, but with the calm and rigor the case required, trying to counter the misinformation spread by the less responsible press. The most fascinating yet disturbing aspect was how that small initial clue, the minimal evidence that seemed insignificant, had opened a door to a much more complex web than we had imagined. It was a constant reminder that in forensic investigation, nothing is trivial, that the truth hides in the smallest detail, and neglecting a detail can be the difference between justice and impunity. The feeling of being in front of something that could resonate beyond our borders, and those moments made me reflect on the immense responsibility we carried on our shoulders. It was as if we were unearthing a legacy of silence that refused to die, and we were the guardians of that nascent flame of justice. Shortly before officially presenting conclusions, in an intimate team meeting, one of the digital analysis specialists made an observation that once again changed the course of the investigation. He had detected a hidden signature within certain altered files that pointed to none other than a well-known name within the local political sphere. It was not a vague suspicion. The technical evidence pointed directly to that figure. This entailed an even greater risk, but also an opportunity to deliver a strong blow against the corruption that haunted us. We debated for long hours on how to proceed, aware that any premature exposure could reverse everything achieved or jeopardize the international cooperation we had managed to assemble. Despite the fear, we moved forward cautiously and determinedly. We decided to consolidate all the evidence before making it public, knowing that transparency had to be backed by solid and irrefutable proof. In parallel, we strengthened internal protocols, trained the team to handle pressure and possible threats, and reinforced communication with international organizations to have support that could protect those involved. It was a difficult decision because sometimes the accused tried to divide us, sow doubts, or delegitimize the work with personal attacks and legal maneuvers. But standing firm in the truth was the only tool we had to resist. Meanwhile, in my personal life, I felt how that burden intertwined with complex emotions. The relationship with the victim's nephew grew in trust and mutual respect, and profound stories offered us a more human perspective, never far from pain or fear, but also from hope. It was those stories, those intimate moments when he told us what he had lived and felt, that reminded me of the importance of our commitment beyond data and evidence. We were not just solving a case, but honoring the memory of a person and giving voice to those who, otherwise, would be condemned to the shadow of oblivion. Finally, after endless weeks of dedicated and meticulous work, the time came to present the final report. I felt a mix of emotions ranging from relief to uncertainty. We knew the toughest battle was still ahead, that this presentation could open doors but also provoke unexpected reactions. However, what filled me the most was the certainty that we had worked with the utmost rigor, with heart and mind, building a narrative that could not be ignored. We had managed to prove that a small piece of evidence, an almost invisible trace, can be the spark that ignites the flame of truth, breaks the silence, and puts those who believe impunity is their right in check. Today, as I remember that case and everything it meant, I realized that the deepest lesson did not come only from scientific norms or legal procedure, but from understanding that justice is a path walked step by step, with patience, courage, and constant vigilance, leaving nothing unseen. I know that sometimes the system seems to be against us, but it is precisely in those moments when we must be firm, because every effort, no matter how small it seems, is a fight against indifference and corruption. That lesson accompanies and drives me because I know that justice is not a final destination, but a path built with deeds and the persistence of those who refuse to accept silence. And here I am, still in that constant tension between science and uncertainty, between hope and risk, remembering that minimal evidence that silently changed the story. I know the journey never ends, that every case, no matter how small or complex, is a battle we must give wholeheartedly. And although some truths take time to come alight, when they do, their power transforms not only the lives of those who seek them, but also the very fabric of society that, although imperfect, retains the capacity to change if we keep firm in vision and commitment. Because, in the end, justice is not just an ideal, but the light born of the patient and brave work of those who refuse to leave us in darkness.